Hello. Well, amazing what we have so far. And what I'm loving is that we are practicing in just segments of 20 minutes. We're practicing and we are learning really, really interesting nuggets. So that's what happened. That's what is going to happen now too, because we are so fortunate to have with us one of the, I would say, one of the top analysts at Forrester. And Katy Tynan is one of those experts that, and something that I love about Forrester overall is that you really go to the big picture and then you go to the application of the big picture. So you go zoom in, zoom out. I personally love it. So we are so thankful, Katy, having you here. I know that we are going to learn so much about culture and about how to build a high performing and friendly cultures. Something that we learn right now from Raj is about friendship and fostering friendship. So thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours. Really looking forward to learning from you.
Well, thank you so very much. It is lovely, lovely to be here, and I'm so grateful that you have me here today to participate in World Happiness Day. And so first of all, I just want to wish everyone a lovely and wonderful day. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen and pop up my presentation. So let's see, and you can tell me if you can see this, and then we will jump right in. So first of all, thank you, Louise, for the introduction. I am Katy Tynan. I'm a principal analyst here at Forrester. And I cover employee experience and future of work. But what I really tell people that I do when I talk about my work is that I cover how to be happier, how to enjoy work, and how to create an environment collaboratively together where we can all be happier at work. So I'm going to talk, and I'll move through this pretty quickly because we don't have hours of time. But I'm going to talk about creating an inclusive culture. And before I jump into how to do that, I want to tell you a little bit about an experience that I had in my life. So this is my family. I always think it's great to start with family and knowing who's who. You can see this is the 1970s. We had our beautiful wide collars and our pretty sweaters. But my parents were teachers. My dad was a French teacher and my mom was a librarian. And they worked at a school that had a benefit. And for any of you who are in HR, this is my favorite benefit ever. I would love to see this propagated around the world to every organization, which is that every 10 years that you worked at this school, you got a year off at half pay, a year off to go explore your passion, a year off to go find and refresh your excitement about the work that you did. So my dad was a French teacher, as I said, and when he had his sabbatical, we did what you might have expected us to do, which is go to France for a year and live in France. Now, I'm just going to backtrack for a second and tell you that in this picture, the only person who spoke French fluently was my dad. So, epic parenting. Right? They didn't have the internet. They didn't have Google. There was no Airbnb. There was no TripAdvisor. There was nothing. They bought 5 plane tickets. They bought 5 suitcases. And we got on a plane. We flew to Paris via Iceland. And we rented a car. We drove to the south of France and rented a house. And we lived there for a year. And because this was not a vacation, it was an experience of living, we enrolled in school. So this is my first grade class, and here we all are, looking very excited, I'm sure, as all first graders are, to have their pictures taken. So take a moment and see if you can find me in this picture. And now I'll help you out. This is what it feels like to be different. This is what it feels like. And so I love this picture because to me it encapsulates what we're trying to fix, which is this idea that being different all by itself doesn't feel good. Being different can make us feel isolated and sad, and we don't want that. And so the goal in the course of this session and in the course of all of our conversations about inclusive culture is how do we create an environment where people don't feel sad and isolated, but rather feel included and feel that powerful sense of belonging, which is really what we're all working towards. So I want to change gears and talk about another person who maybe felt a little isolated in her career. And this is a software developer named Ayanna Kyoguku. And she started at Nintendo in 2003. She was working on some parts of the Legend of Zelda franchise in 2003. And you can see here a quote from her that when she came on board in 2003, and this is typical of my experience too, I spent quite a bit of time in tech back in the early 2000s. It wasn't uncommon to be the only woman in the entire team. And you think about that for a minute and how isolating that might feel. So this was not uncommon, as you can see, because tech in general and software development specifically typically is a very male-dominated industry. So when she was working on some of these products, one of the things that they asked her to take a look at was this product called Animal Crossing. And I don't know how many of you have been playing Animal Crossing since it came out in March of this year, and I'm going to talk a little bit about their performance. But this quote is from the CEO at the time, Nintendo CEO at the time, who observed something really interesting and different about who was buying Animal Crossing. And this is the new Leaf product that came out in 2014. And he noticed that this largest group was 19 to 24-year-old women, which again was surprising because the typical demographic, which we'll talk about in a minute at that time, of gamers across the board was typically men, not women. So he noticed this. And then on top of that, he noticed that when people bought the 3DS, which was the actual hardware, combined with the Animal Crossing product, New Leaf, you see a 56% female user base. And again, astonishing because when we look at the distribution of gamers, we see that, especially at that time, back here, that it was still very much predominantly a male buyer who was coming in and buying video games in general. So here they are, here's Nintendo, and they're observing this and saying, this is interesting, this is different. And this is a lot of what I do as an analyst. I look at patterns and I look at outliers. We like to see when things are different because then we can look into them a little bit and try and understand what happened. Why did that outcome happen? So in this case, what we saw was that for both New Leaf and for ultimately Animal Crossing New Horizons, that Nintendo made an intentional decision. So the CEO observed that buying trend, and they then made an intentional decision to create a gender-balanced video game development team to develop the next versions of Animal Crossing. So Ayanna Kyoguku, who I mentioned before, who was one of the few female software developers that was at Nintendo back in 2000, came into this project. And on that team, you also had Kazuya Iguchi, who was her counterpart. And the two of them together were a gender-balanced leadership team. And what they saw here is that both of them had this strong, strong commitment to the idea that everyone was going to be able to play this game and enjoy it, that it was going to be targeted so broadly and be so intentionally inclusive at a design level that it was going to be something that anyone could play. So we see both of these members of the leadership team saying, wow, look at this. When we bring together an inclusive team, a gender-balanced software development team, it feels different. It feels better. It feels great because we hear a diversity of ideas. We can share these ideas. And really, she felt, and both of them felt, that this was a different kind of team than some of the other ones that they had been on before. Okay, so why does this matter? Why are we talking about Animal Crossing New Horizons? These are launch sales. And these are launch sales of a whole bunch of different pieces of software and software products. And what you can see here is on the far left, Grand Theft Auto 5 is a crazy outlier, right? It's a cross-platform game. It was on Xbox. It was on almost every platform. You could play it on your PC. And so the launch sales of Grand Theft Auto were outrageous compared to any other video game of all time. And it's still a huge seller. But right behind that, Animal Crossing New Horizons in 2020 blew away the sales numbers at launch of just about every other video game on the market. And that's telling. It's important because Animal Crossing is a weird game. If you've ever played it, it's not a first-person shooter. It's not a typical video game. There's no villain. You show up on an island, a raccoon gives you an unlimited amount of money, and you hang out with your friends. It's a very different sort of video game. So to see, again, this outlier, this performance that was different than what you saw in other video games, tells you that they did something different when they created it. And now we know from what I just showed you, one of those things that they did differently, which is that they had this inclusive, gender-balanced development team that created the game. And you might say to me, well, Katy, this is a pandemic. It was launched in March. Of course, it had crazy sales because everybody was sitting at home playing video games, right? Well, no, because actually Doom Eternal launched the same week as Animal Crossing New Horizons, was just as anticipated, and falls below the 3 million mark of units sold in the first launch. So it's not just because of when it launched. It is because of the way it was designed and because of the broad appeal and inclusivity and the way that people felt like they belonged in this space and on their islands. So we've talked a little bit about this Nintendo example, and I wanted to talk about it as just a good case study of what we see as an outcome and as a result when we have inclusive culture. But now I want to talk about what culture is, because a lot of times when people throw around the word culture, people are like, oh yeah, culture, but people don't really know what we're talking about. So a lot of you have probably heard this, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Some of you may have seen this, which is the culture of an organization is what the leaders accept. The worst behavior a leader tolerates is the definition of the culture of that organization. And so this is why culture is so important. But what we really know is that culture is about values. So we define culture by how you take your organizational values and you put them into action. So now we're going to talk about inclusive culture. What do we mean by inclusive culture and why is it so important? So inclusive culture values the strength that comes from being different. So remember, if we think all the way back to Sad Katy with her pigtails in the very beginning, inclusive culture is about feeling like you're part of something and being able to bring your whole self into that work and feel like you belong there. And so it's valuing that strength of being different, not feeling isolated about being different. And I talked a lot here about Nintendo and about this gender balance in video games. And I wanted really to talk about a positive example when I started this conversation, because I think we see a lot of negative examples, right? So I'm just going to bring up one negative example of what happens when you don't have inclusive culture in your organizational design. So this went viral. This was a hand soap dispenser. It happened to be in a Facebook office, but it had nothing to do with Facebook. It has to do with the design, the people who built the hand soap dispenser, right? So they built a hand soap dispenser, and what you can see here is that hand soap dispenser would only dispense into white hands because of the way it was designed. So the question you have to ask yourself is, who was on that development team? Who designed that product? And I think we can infer from this that it was not inclusive. And as a result, they got a huge amount of bad press, because it was so visible that they had produced a product that was biased. And that's a problem. It's a problem for all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, because that's the practice that we do in organizations to create these environments where we can have these outcomes, where we can have belonging as an outcome of inclusive culture. So at first, when we first started doing this work, a lot of people focused on diversity. So the idea was, how do we get more people from underrepresented groups to come work with us? And the problem with that is we didn't create an environment that was welcoming. Those people felt different. They felt isolated, and so they left. So we realized diversity just by itself is not a hiring problem. Like, we can't just go out and hire different people. We have to do something else. So that's when we started talking about this dual practice of diversity and inclusion. So this was the idea of how to create an environment that supports a diverse community of employees. That sounds really good, right? But it didn't work entirely. And the reason it didn't work entirely was because just because you create surface improvements and maybe some community, employee resource groups, things like that, which are all good and important practices, it doesn't solve for this other part of the process, which is structural inequalities, things that prevent people from being successful, that are built into the way our businesses operate. So that's when we talk about this idea of equity. How do we eliminate some of those structural barriers so that we're creating an environment where everyone has this opportunity to succeed? And that's the outcome we're looking for, right? Which is that when we create an environment that's equitable, that's inclusive, then people feel like they belong. And lo and behold, when we see belonging in an organizational culture, what we see is outsized performance. We see better performance. We see happier people. And so that is, of course, the long-term goal. So I'm going to talk quickly about what we mean by equity. And again, I'm going to fly through these slides a little bit so that we have a little time to chat at the end. But equity has two meanings. One is this meaning of justice, and specifically freedom from bias. And that's super important. And the second meaning, which some of us know, is about value. How we have value in an organization. If we're offered equity by our company, we're being offered stock, we're being offered value. And so as we think about creating equity, we're talking about both of those things, both the fairness factor and the value, the shared value. And again, that goes back to the definition of inclusive culture, this shared value of how we together have this ability to drive an organization forward because we share in the outcomes and the results. So I love this quote. Even if we weren't talking about all of the other things today, if this is the only thing you remember, it's so valuable, right? If you have a garden and it's not growing, you don't blame the seeds. You don't blame the plants. You go and try and understand why. And so if you are part of an organization and you are trying to make it more inclusive, more equitable, the first place you need to look is at that environment and how we can help everyone have the tools they need to be successful. I have another quick example here when we're talking about equity. This is an example from a school teacher who was trying to explain equity to the kids in her class. And she said, okay, let's do it this way. I have a first aid kit. So come on up and tell me what you need help with. So a little girl came up and she pretended and she said, I have a boo-boo on my finger. And the teacher put a Band-Aid on her finger. And then the next student came up and said, I have a headache. And the teacher put a Band-Aid on the student's finger. And the third person came up and said, I stubbed my toe. And the teacher put a Band-Aid on the student's finger. That is equality. That's treating everyone the same. But it's not equity. It's not treating people so that they have what they need to be successful. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about equity. So just to close out a little bit, there's a couple of things that we observed here at Forrester. We are a research company, which means that we look at a lot of data. And what we see when we look at the data is that there are a lot of people who think about this work of belonging in organizations, of cultures of belonging and inclusivity, as something you do to be nice. And it is nice, but it's also really profitable. It's also really good business. So at the end of the day, organizations that create an inclusive work environment are out-competing in their market. And that's what we saw at Nintendo. That's what we saw with Animal Crossing, is not only is it the right thing to do, but it's a smart business thing to do. So I'm going to skip past this model quickly. This is part of our report on the business of belonging and some of the things that are necessary in order to create an environment where people feel like they belong, and these are important. And I just want to go quickly through some of these things that Nintendo did right, some of these things that we saw as the right answer, so you can see how you might be able to apply this in your own organization. So first of all, they observed an opportunity. The CEO looked at that outlier data of who was buying their product and said, huh, that's interesting. And then they took a calculated risk. They decided to do something different because of that data. And then they intentionally selected the right leadership, the people who were committed to that inclusivity, committed to that improvement and that creation of something that was really going to appeal to a lot of people. And they were very, very successful. So just to close out and to give you some things to think about as we end the session, again, this strategy of inclusivity is good business strategy. It's also a great driver of innovation. This is how we create organizations that relate well to their customers. This is how we create organizations that try new things. And it's not just about hiring. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels like they belong. So I want to thank you all so much for hanging out with me for a little bit today. And I'm just going to come out of here and stop sharing so that we can talk a little bit and see what your reactions are. So thanks so much again for joining.
Wow. Thank you so much. I love difference. Um, so interesting when I saw your picture. It's beautiful. I mean, the way you linked that picture with the whole narrative is so amazing. And having myself two teenagers, and now with COVID, we travel a lot, and we actually move from state to state and country to country, and we are always, as a family, trying to help our kids to belong as soon as possible without feeling excluded or bullied.
Yeah.
So this is something that we know how you feel when you feel excluded. I really love, Katie, the way you make the case to create diversity and culture with diversity. Can we go a bit deeper, because we have 4 more minutes for one or
Of
two
course.
questions about cases? Can you share with us maybe if we can name, or maybe the industry where you feel that it's possible? I know a bit the retail industry. I mean, I know different industries, and in retail, if people who are at the store level, that's where you see that there is a lot of disconnection, and especially the managers are not really good. I mean, the rotation is huge. So because there is no linkage at all to maybe to the headquarters and the corporate level. So can we talk a bit more about maybe cases by industry where you see that there are more challenges, and if
Yeah.
we have some cases where we can say, oh wow, these guys are doing it really well.
So I'll use two examples. The first one is, I was just reading an article this morning about some artificial intelligence that I think Google had built. It's facial recognition technology, right? So it's AI technology that looks at faces. And the team that built it was thinking really hard about not having this be biased, because when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about facial recognition, there has been a lot of problems with how that was implemented. So they went into this saying, we're going to do it right. And they didn't. So they went in trying to do it right. They took out words. So instead of using things like businessman, they said business person. So they tried to remove some of that language, but they still ended up with an algorithm where when it showed a man, it said things like official and leader as tags. And when it showed a woman, it showed things like smile. So the problem is, even when we go in with the right intent, sometimes we have a bad result. And I want to call this out because the technology industry is still 80 to 85% male. So the people who work in tech, who are designing the products that all of us use, every human on earth is using technology, and yet is being designed by an 80% skewed male workforce.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. And I think when we hear about diversity, we hear sometimes about this idea of thought diversity, right? We don't need real diversity. We only need diversity of thought. We need people who think differently. And to me, this example just busts that myth wide open, because the truth is, you do need real diversity. You need all across the whole spectrum of diversity to do a better job of overcoming some of these things so that we can rely on it. So that's one example. That's the tech industry.
Great.
I'm going to use another example where I feel diversity is super important, which is healthcare. So imagine for a moment that you go into the hospital And you don't understand because you don't speak the language that is the primary language of that hospital environment that you're in. Imagine the fear and the anxiety you're going to have. Imagine if you have particular cultural issues with healthcare and you don't feel like you're understood by the people who are providing you that care. And healthcare is universal. We all get sick. Every human being is going to interact with the healthcare system. And yet our doctors are predominantly still not a diverse population, not fully representative of the people that they're serving. So those are some examples where I feel like there's real challenges and real concern, real risk for us as a society. If we don't have diversity, if we are not helping people become doctors, become tech leaders, become all of these things, we're going to hurt ourselves as a society. We won't have the things we need to be well. We won't have the things we need to stay connected. So those are some places that I think are just really critically important to focus on.
I love it. Some companies, in order to build a case, they like to link everything to profit and to revenues and to basically the top line and the bottom line. Do you have any numbers somewhere where we can actually give some confidence to leaders watching about building the business case?
Yeah, so it's funny, maybe 10 years ago, most organizations were not measuring these things, right? They weren't producing the metrics that would allow us to connect the dots. And now we see a lot more reporting. So in the US, you look at the S&P 500, you look at all of these organizations that are publicly traded, and a lot of them are reporting on inclusion and diversity, and particularly their leadership diversity stats as part of what they do. So now we can measure it. And lo and behold, what we find is there's a 4-point profit difference between companies that invest in inclusion and companies that don't.
Wow.
So 4 percentage point higher profitability for companies that are investing in inclusion and inclusive practices. And that's just one stat, right? We have lots of them. And so we are seeing more and more that not only do we know it intellectually that it's good business strategy, but we see it in the results and we can report out on it. So yes, there are lots of examples now that you can find. There's a website that actually keeps a running list of all of these stats of how inclusion and diversity actually impacts the business outcomes.
I love it. Let's get to that link and let's share it with everybody. That's so important. And one final question: where do you start? Because right now, and we see this especially in the US, so many companies are hiring a chief diversity officer. Right? It's so much going on around social justice, around racial diversity. So is the first step to hire a chief diversity officer, or what else do you need to really do this right?
Yeah, so I do see a lot of that, right? A lot of organizations sort of rushing to say, we've appointed a chief diversity officer, there, we're done. And we know that's not the answer. And the reason we know that's not the answer is actually because, and there was a wonderful Wall Street Journal article on this, chief diversity officers are reporting that they're frustrated. And they're frustrated because they get hired, but they don't get a budget, they don't get a team, they don't get any resources, or some of them are people who are they have full-time jobs in other parts of the organization, and they're just getting this title added so that the company can say, haha, we have a chief diversity officer. So it's not about any kind of sort of visible way of saying, look, we're doing this. It's about actions. And we all know this in our relationships. We know there's a difference between saying we care about this and what you do, what your actions portray. So in mature companies, in successful companies that are doing this work well, they're doing it in this sort of 5-part model, which I talk about in my Business of Belonging report, which starts sometimes, people start in different places, right? Some people will start with inclusion, and they'll really look at their inclusive practices, and they'll start to build out that community element. That's a great place to start. Other people start with accountability. What KPIs are we going to use to measure this, and who's going to own them in the organization? Other people start with a listening program. How do we go into our organization and really hear what people are worried about and how we can make this better within our organization? Other people start with equity and say, oh, how are we going to break down some of these barriers that are systemic, that are preventing people from getting ahead? There's no wrong place to start. But what we know is that until you have initiatives and practices that are in all of those areas, that are systemic in your organization, and that accountability goes all the way up to the top and all the way down throughout the whole organization, you don't make progress until that becomes a sustainable practice that you're doing continuously over time. So I asked one of the people that we interviewed, I said, do you get asked the question, because she's a chief diversity officer, I said, do you get asked the question, when are we going to be done? And she said, all the time, right? All the time people come to her and say, okay, when are we going to be finished with this effort? And she said, when you have all the innovation you want, all the revenue you want, all the diversity you want, all the talent you want, then you'll be done, which is never, right? We're never going to be done, because the reality is this is just a good business practice. You're never going to be done measuring your finances, right? You're never going to be done having a corporate strategy. So you're never going to be done with this either, but that's okay. It's just a fundamental practice that every business should be doing.
Yeah. Wow, so powerful. Let's go let's go deeper into your report. I really want to go and get the full perspective, but actually what we got today is really, really insightful and really powerful. So thank you so much, Katy. Katy Tynan, chief analyst at Forrester. Thank you so much for all what you do and for bringing so much clarity to so many people. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.